Okay, now let's talk about the remainder of Chapter 8, mostly the light-independent reactions, or otherwise known as the Calvin cycle, the Melvin-Calvin cycle. So, yes, the Calvin cycle. All right, so here, this is the part of photosynthesis where we're going to use the products of the light reactions, that is the ATP and the NADPH, to provide energy to run this cycle where we're going to take carbon dioxide, several of them, and essentially put them together through this chemical reaction into simple three-carbon sugars. Okay, so from the relatively simple carbon dioxide to a more complex sugar. All right. Now, in this diagram, the little dots represent carbon molecules. Okay, and so it is a cycle. Unlike the light reactions are sort of a linear process, whereas the Calvin cycle is indeed a cycle. Um, and so it starts where we have a a 5 carbon molecule that incorporates a carbon dioxide to become a 6 carbon molecule, but it quickly breaks into a 3 carbon molecule. All right, so that's a little confusing, I imagine, but basically we're taking in several of these carbon dioxides and forming 3 carbon molecules by binding them to another molecule. And I want you to remember that we have 3 carbons in our first molecule because this basic form of photosynthesis we're looking at is sometimes described as C3 photosynthesis. Okay, we make a 3 carbon molecule in the first step. Okay, now here is where we start incorporating the energy that was gathered in the light reactions in the form of the ATP and the NADPH. Okay, and essentially we're taking this 3 carbon molecule and we're energizing it, and we're able to make this sugar from this process. And I want you to notice that for every 6 carbon dioxides that come into the process, we make 2 3 carbon sugars, okay? The rest of the carbons in the process just continue on. Some energy is provided on this side where we're regenerating this 5 carbon molecule that begins the process, okay? Now, one thing that's not on here that I want you to be aware of is that at this step, right here where we're taking in the CO2, there is this enzyme that's very important. It's known as Rubisco, and this is an enzyme, and of course enzymes facilitate reactions. It's facilitating this reaction. This enzyme basically grabs on to CO2. It's the enzyme in plants, in their chloroplasts, in the stroma, that has an affinity for CO2 and grabs onto it and pulls it into the cycle. Okay. Um, all right, so several carbons in, this enzyme Rubisco grabs onto them, and then through a series of steps where we're using the energized molecules from the light reactions, we're able to produce these relatively simple sugars. Now these 3 carbon sugars can be combined, of course, to make a 6 carbon sugar, and that would be glucose in this case. So that's the primary sugar we're going to make through these reactions of the Calvin cycle. Then, of course, you can take several glucose molecules, bond them together, because the glucose is a monomer, it's a simple sugar. If you bond several of them together, you can make a polysaccharide, and in this case, with plants, you can make starch. And so the light reactions combined with Calvin cycle make a simple sugar, and then the plant, through other reactions, can bind them together to make starch and store that starch in something like a potato, for example. All right, now let's talk about some other things here. So now this process of photosynthesis is a chemical reaction that occurs at a particular rate. As you can imagine, there are things that can influence the rate at which that reaction occurs. At its most simple, you can imagine light will play a role. And if you have more or less light, that can speed up or slow down the reaction. And indeed, that's what we see in this graph here. So, of course, the amount of light you have can affect the rate of photosynthesis. As we see here, as the light level increases, the rate of photosynthesis increases. But here they're comparing two different kinds of plants, a sun plant, a shade plant. That is one that grows in the shade and one that grows out in the sun. And you can see their responses is somewhat different. And you also notice as you reach you can reach a certain level of light at which what basically happens. I'll let you think about that. We'll discuss it in class. Of course, what other things can influence the rate of photosynthesis? Well, of course, the amount of water that you have. What else? Do you think maybe the temperature can influence the rate of photosynthesis, perhaps? Other things you can think of, maybe? We'll discuss it in class. So, indeed, temperature and moisture levels can indeed affect the rate of photosynthesis. And there are certain types of plants that have taken this basic type of photosynthesis, combining light reactions in the Calvin cycle, and modified those that way of doing photosynthesis that in particular are adaptations to hot and dry conditions. Okay. Notice, remember up here I used the term C3. Well, there indeed are many types of plants that are just called C3 plants. And most of the plants that grow around here in Tennessee are C3 plants. But if you go to drier regions, the southwest United States, for example, out in the deserts, you'll find a higher proportion of these C4 and CAM plants. They are plants adapted to hot, dry conditions. So what they do is the C4 plants, these are ones that they have an extra step that's added on. Okay, they do the light reactions, they do the Calvin cycle, but they have this extra step. And what this extra step does is it is an enzyme they have that, in addition to having rubisco, they have this other enzyme that grabs onto CO2. All right. And so you'll remember I talked about stomata. And stomata are these openings in leaves. And if a plant starts to dry out, of course the stomata will close. And that's an adaptation to conserve water. So what happens then is a C3 plant, once the stomata closes up, it pretty much has to start shutting down photosynthesis because it's running out of CO2. Okay. That is, once you close up the stomata, the CO2 levels inside the leaf are going to start to decrease. Well, the way C4 plants operate is that they will close up their stomata to save water, but because they have this extra enzyme, they are more efficient than your basic C3 plant at grabbing onto that CO2. So as the CO2 levels drop inside that leaf, you'll reach a point at which a C3 plant basically does not have enough CO2 left to really do anything. But C4 plants are more efficient at using that carbon dioxide such that they can keep on photosynthesizing for a longer amount of time after they've closed up the leaves. So this is a good adaptation to have if you live in a dry environment because you're often going to have to close up. And your basic C3 plant will shut down, but your C4 plant will keep on going. And so what happens is this enzyme that is really efficient at grabbing onto CO2 basically force feeds that CO2 into the Calvin cycle. The C3 plant will shut down, C4 plant keeps going. All right, CAM plant. These plants, their adaptation to dry conditions is that they basically close their stomata during the day, no matter what, and they're open at night. Of course, at night it's cooler and there's less um, uh, pressure, there's less evaporative pressure from the leaves. So when you have your stomata open at night, you won't lose as much water as during the daytime through your leaves, but you can basically acquire the CO2 you need. So basically, can plants get all the CO2 they can during the night. During the day, they close up to save water, and they take the CO2 that they have basically acquired at night and convert it into this organic acid that they can store. And then during the day, they break that organic acid down and release CO2 into the Calvin cycle. So they're able to do, of course, their light reactions and then the Calvin cycle using this CO2 that was basically stored during the night. So they have what you would describe as a temporal separation of steps. That is, they get their CO2 at night at one time of the day, store it, and then make use of it during the daytime. All right. So that's that for photosynthesis. We'll talk about this some more in class.